So hi everyone. Welcome to Exploring the White Paper, a people-driven approach delivering NHS Homes. Our speakers today are Sarah Hordern of Perspiccio and Roly Martin of Global City Futures, co-authors of the White Paper, and they will introduce themselves shortly. I'd just like to mention a few things. So this webinar is being recorded and will be available later. Please add any questions for the speakers during the webinar today in the question and answer tab at the bottom of your screen. There will be 20 minutes at the end for question and answer. So any questions that you have, please do pop through to the speakers. Any questions you ask today will either be answered here live, or the ones that we won't get to will be emailed a question and answer document later with all the answers to any questions that can't be answered today. You can join our LinkedIn page or subscribe via our website. Contact Sarah or Roly directly with any questions and to be kept updated. I will be passing those details through while we sort of run the live chat and the webinar today. I'm going to introduce them both. I will let them introduce themselves and off you go, guys.
Thanks, Kate. So just checking that you can see my screen, Kate. Great. So good morning, everyone. Welcome. Thank you very much for joining us. I'm really conscious that a lot of you joined us at the launch event at Perkins and Will, but equally there's probably 50% who didn't. So for those of you who've heard certainly my part before, apologies. Roly's going to go into more detail on the accounting treatment than we went into at the launch event, and then we will make sure there's plenty of time for Q&A at the end. Okay. So just introducing the NHS Homes Alliance for those of you new to the conversation. It's very much a range of organisations who've been looking at the opportunities to create quality, affordable homes that support staff recruitment and retention in the NHS. And that conversation's gone on between NHS trusts, integrated care boards, developers, housing associations, capital providers, finance, legal and real estate advisors. And having individually discovered that what seems like a good idea has a number of significant challenges and roadblocks, I think there's been a general view that this is a problem, a challenge better solved collectively. And we're really grateful to the organisations at the bottom of this slide who provided the sponsorship to get the white paper off the ground. So who am I? Sarah Hordern. I wear two hats. I'm a non-exec director at Oxford University Hospitals, NHS FT, and I'm also the CEO of the regeneration consultancy Perspiccio. And probably the most relevant thing is I speak 3 languages required for this conversation, which is property, finance, and NHS.
Hi, and I'm Roly Martin. I'm Managing Director at Global City Futures, where we effectively help the NHS and local authority organisations just deliver the right sort of infrastructure, but in this case, key worker homes, clinical facilities, and just helping them through that business case process.
So the starting point for this conversation is very much focused on this being a people challenge. As many of those on the call will know far better than me, the NHS is under the greatest pressure it's seen in the last 75 years. And one of the most significant challenges is the recruitment and retention of our amazing people. We saw through the pandemic what insiders already knew. It can be really tough working in the NHS. It's a challenging working environment, and the rising cost of living and property in particular, with long commutes on top of long shifts. So it's not entirely surprising that when we did a staff survey at Oxford, 68% of those responding said the cost of property was the #1 reason for leaving the trust in the next 2 years. And good quality homes close to work in attractive, sustainable communities shouldn't be a pipe dream for the health and social care workers. Recruitment and retention varies from trust to trust. It's different. It's not one size fits all. So whether it's the accommodation for junior doctors in Swindon, whether it's band 5, 6 nurses looking for family homes in Oxford, or whether it's porters and domestic staff looking for homes in Harrogate, or actually, as Caroline, who I think is on the call, will tell you in Torbay, it's all of those. So the needs are different. It's not one size fits all. The white paper has been an organic conversation. but it follows on partly from the Naylor report. So Naylor advocated selling NHS land to deliver 26,000 homes and using the funds from that to fund clinical facilities. But what's been clear is that land assets and the need for facilities don't always align, and open market housing sales have not led to homes for NHS people. So the white paper conversation is focused on delivering NHS homes on NHS lands initially, and that was very deliberate. It was about trying to put our hands around a conversation that we could actually deliver change for. But I know that Ian Burden is on the call from the NHS, and he's been working really hard on additional projects, including homestay and home share. And the great news is there's now a staff accommodation page on the NHS website looking at those opportunities. But equally, for our wider public sector colleagues, we think that the model we're talking about here would work across the public sector estate. And the focus is on retaining control of land, whether it's at NHS or wider public sector, and using patient capital to deliver enjoyable places to work and to live. And we think that you can leverage that weight of capital that's currently available through pensions and other patient capital, looking for long-dated, inflation-correlated returns without an explicit requirement for ownership. I did tell you we're going to start talking finance. And whether that's 30 to 60-year leases, but fundamentally looking to deliver integrated communities with rents at the levels that can support recruitment and retention. So not just linked to open market value, but actually linked at affordable, given the salaries that are being paid. And those homes being rented directly to our NHS people, and the buildings and the income streams reverting to the NHS in the long term. And moving into the property universe and viability, it's a challenge. Whether that's fundamentally the value of the building when it's finished needs to be more than the cost of building it. And the way that the property universe values that building is the net rent divided by the yield or cost of capital. So with interest rates going up, that yield requirement has changed, and the value of the buildings when completed is coming down. So that challenge is getting worse at the moment. Traditionally, the property market has looked to drive up rents in order to improve viability. In this case, we're looking at retaining NHS people, so that's not where we go. So we need to look at how else we can help viability, whether that's yield and cost of capital, whether that's reducing the risk and therefore helping the developers look at their margins, whether that's looking at land value, and also looking at the wider value that's generated in the trust income and expenditure account from those lower rents. So there are two mission critical things that we wanted to talk about first in order to deliver this. So the first of these is CDEL, and I'll explain that in a minute. And the second is an agreement that you can retain the land in the NHS. And both of those for our non-NHS colleagues are going to feel quite alien. I found coming into the NHS from outside that these were totally bizarre concepts, but they're problems we have to solve. So CDEL, or Capital Departmental Expenditure Limit. So the capital that a trust can spend in any 1 year is controlled ultimately by the Treasury, then from the Treasury to DHSC, from them through NHS England into the Integrated Care Board and down to the trust. And regardless of how much cash they have or the funding that they have available, the trust cannot exceed that CDEL envelope in any 1 year. And it's insufficient for all the competing needs we currently see, whether that's medical equipment, whether that's the clinical estate, whether that's digital infrastructure. So there is absolutely not capacity for delivering NHS homes from the current CDEL brackets in the majority of trusts. There are some that do have a CDEL envelope. And so the white paper set out not to challenge that CDEL proposition and ask the Treasury for more CDEL. It set about looking at how we might be able to deliver these homes without impacting on CDEL. And that's where ROLI comes in.
Thanks, Sarah. Yeah, so if you've had a chance to look through the white paper, you'll see that there are lots of facets to the practical delivery and some of the key barriers around viability and planning and procurement and the white paper does make an assumption that we need a CDEL compliant model, albeit there are other models that are being tested. But I suppose the CDEL issue is well understood in terms of a key limitation in delivering key worker homes. So we we set out how that model looks and just declared that it was CDEL compliant. So I am going to have to talk a little bit about accounting and how we've got there. So if you could just bear with when we get to that point, I will try and make it as user-friendly as possible. Thanks, Sarah. So as I said, we looked at multiple models in the white paper, and there are different stages of testing and maturity, and some cater to having CDEL in the pocket. But in the many cases where there is no CDEL, how do we deliver something? So we're running 3 or 4 business cases right now for different NHS trusts for key worker accommodation projects using this commercial setup, using this model. So it's in a kind of a practical application stage and some in a pre-procurement stage, which is really helpful because we were allowed that market feedback. Again, that's all on the basis of this model. And just to be clear, those business cases, and we're all here for the same reason, I mean, the strategic case is to solve the people problem. We need the homes, they need to be affordable, and we need to solve the people problem. That's really important. And then the economic case, I suppose, in your business case, is just the scheme design. How do we best, on that footprint of land, put a reasonable and top quality accommodation facility, and what's the best value for money way of doing that in terms of numbers of units and configuration that fits the staff survey that many trusts have done and fits what the staff demand needs are for that accommodation. And then that comes down to the commercial case, which then drives all of the outputs and the budgeting and the finance that allows this to take its next steps. So this is all done on the basis of this model, which, to describe very briefly, the trust will provide a land lease to the private sector partner, either at peppercorn or at value, and there's some flex in that, and depending on the model and the economics of the model. The trust will provide a land lease to a third party, which then brings their own capital to the table and builds and finances the accommodation facilities, which are then let directly to the NHS tenants. So the trust is able to enter into a nominations contract that effectively says we get first refusal to put our staff into that facility, and where we don't have that take up, where there isn't demand, then there's a cascade of nominations that goes to perhaps other blue light workers or other public sector workers. And then beyond that, right down at the bottom of that cascade, they can be marketed on the open market. But typically the demand is so high, and we're all here today because we know that demand is so high. So that nominations contract is pretty tight in the sense that there is high demand for NHS staff. So then the investor or third party will take the rents directly from the tenants over a concession period, and then at the end of that period, that head lease will fall away, and then the property returns back to the trust. So all things being well, the investors made their money back as a result of the rentals, and then it returns back to the trust, and they carry on maintaining and delivering that accommodation thereafter. So that's kind of the model and how it works. I'm happy to take questions on that as if anyone has clarifications on that. The key point here is that the investor is charged with investing and building and then maintaining the accommodation, but also taking the demand risk or the void risk, if you like, and that's quite a key point, which I'll come to in a minute. So how's this done then? Why is this a CDEL compliant model? So I've got the accounting frameworks on the screen here just to demonstrate there are different ways of recording sets of books, and this is really important. But so I'll try and get through this as quickly as possible, but in a way that is easily understood. So Treasury has its own set of accounts, which is under IFRS, which is International Financial Reporting Standards, and they have the manual on government deficit and debt. Separately, NHS trusts just use IFRS as interpreted by their FREM and now the GAM. Local authorities have IFRS as interpreted by the code, and higher education uses the SORP. But it's just an important distinction because different organisations use different interpretations of how IFRS is used. So if we can move on, yeah. So for NHS trusts, they'll produce their set of accounts under IFRS, and then they produce a standard set of IFRS accounts. They are then consolidated into the budgets that then go into the Department of Health and then up into the Treasury. And it's that consolidation process that ends up being pushed through the manual on government deficit and debt. And basically, they're kind of the same. The MGDD just says use IFRS. However, there are a few differences, and those differences are very specific to the use of private capital in delivering infrastructure projects. And to be clear, private capital using to deliver public infrastructure has been going on for many, many decades. It's been very necessary for a long, long time. And typically a risk approach is taken on that to say whoever is financing something must own it, more or less. So why is this important in terms of the distinction? Could we just move on to the next slide? So for an NHS trust, in the model that we described earlier, using their IFRS accounts, they would have to follow IFRIC 12, which is a service concession accounting standard. And you don't need to read all of this right now, and I'm happy to take questions on it. But in a nutshell, if you apply the model that we put on screen earlier, it will determine that the trust has to record the value of the facility, the value of the new accommodation on its balance sheet. And before finance directors start to panic about the CDEL implications of that, there are those two distinctions and those dual sets of accounts that I mentioned earlier. But for a trust set of accounts, it'll have the facility on its balance sheet and a corresponding liability entry. However, moving into the MGDD, and this is the key point on the next slide, please. At a Treasury level and a Department of Health level, the model that we've described earlier is characterized as a PPP, which is effectively private money delivering public infrastructure, which, as I said, has been used for decades and decades. And as a basic rule, it takes a risk-based test and says whoever's constructing it and keeping it available effectively has that on their balance sheet. So it's not a public sector asset, and therefore no CDEL would be required. So that's how that model is constructed, such that it passes that construction and availability risk onto the private sector or away from the public sector. And as a result, no CDEL is required. And that's a really key point because it means that where we can get projects to stack up, and the ones that we're doing at the moment to stack up, we're confident that we don't need to make a CDEL application, and that makes things a lot easier to push through. This is also done in practice. If you're on the webinar and you're at an NHS trust, you'll know that in your financial submissions that go to the Department of Health at the end of the year, there's a key line in it which literally just eliminates all projects that are from private sector finance. And there's a specific line to eliminate that from that submission. So it happens in practical application terms as well. And this has been done, let's just think of a practical application in car parks, for example. So all of the car parks in the NHS, which are run by the private sector, were invested in by the private sector in terms of building those car parks, and then they collect the fare box from users of the car parks directly. And that model is no different. So it's not an untested or unused model in the NHS. It's just new to accommodation. And of course, there are some specifics around housing that are in the white paper around planning and procurement, which we need to get through. But nevertheless, from the finance side of things, it is a well-used and well-understood model. Okay, so on the next slide, just to be clear, and again, a car park example is very good for this. This is the specific guidance that the NHS released to help NHS trusts account for their car park projects effectively, which is to say, if you have private money coming into the NHS to deliver you some infrastructure for which you make no payments at all because the end users are paying, i.e. drivers, or in this case, tenants, this is how you account for it. And in doing so, there's no financial liability that sits on the trust books. Rather, you have deferred income, which is effectively a release of income to the trust's profit and loss every year. So it's a very neat and tidy solution because it kind of has a net financial zero impact on an NHS trust's profit and loss. So yeah, no different, and it makes real sense in terms of the accounting and budgeting. It's how do we get through all of the other barriers in terms of planning and procurement and viability, which are the really interesting bits. So just very quickly around benefits of the off-balance sheet model. Of course, no capital budget required, which is great. There's no underwrite required and therefore no risk apportioned to the trust. It is a tried and tested model. This model is also out for pending approval from Treasury. It's been well socialised and we're in discussions on that. And it attracts institutional capital. And of course, the best bit is, of course, the land is retained by the NHS. There's residual value capture at the end of the contract. And these are all really big ticks for getting these projects away with a lot of the execs that we've been speaking to. Of course, in terms of risk, we do rely on market appetite and we rely on the right capital coming forward. We have to consider the tax implications in terms of SDLT and VAT, all of which your tax advisors will be able to deal with very well. Moving on to the next slide, we've got so just a quick piece on viability, and I think we're going to move on to how this links into the estate code in a minute, Sarah. But the typical model that we're looking at, in a normal build to rent scenario, and I think we have the right delegates today who understand that. In a normal build to rent scenario, you'd buy some land, build something, and then rent it out and recover your capital that way. So you would typically expect to charge a market rent. And this is really important. We're trying to solve a people problem here. We're trying to give NHS staff somewhere that is affordable to live on site. So we're reducing their travel costs, we're giving an uplift to their well-being, all of which can be recorded in an economic case in terms of that well-being and better workforce. But how do we get that discount? So a lot of the projects we're doing assume that the land value is transferred in at a peppercorn lease rate to the third party. And that's really helpful because the value of that peppercorn lease can represent kind of the fat in the model, the viability in the model, and you can then apply a discount commensurate with that, the value of that land that otherwise is put in at peppercorn. So while that's not kind of a means tested or salary band 1, band 2, band 3 tested solution, it takes the first steps to applying a reasonable and sensible discount that is mirroring the economics of the project, and we're finding some good success in that. However, there are some estate code issues there in terms of what is the value of that land and how can it be transferred. And Sarah, over to you again.
Thanks, Rowley. And I know Ian's raised in the questions about the fact that that model is not currently signed off by NHSE and HMT. So we'll pick that up in the questions at the end, Rowley, and you can talk a bit more to that. But yes, you're right. So in terms of NHS estate code, and again, for those, and I know there are some on the call that don't deal with the NHS on a regular basis, the estate code is the framework, does what it says on the tin, but it's the framework for dealing with the NHS estate. And currently, it requires surplus land to be disposed of for best value. And that best value is defined as the RICS Red Book valuation. So broadly, if you're trying to sell land which has potential for housing, open market housing is always going to trump affordable housing. The difference here is that we think that when you deliver housing for key workers, and particularly NHS key workers, effectively that helps recruitment and retention. And there's a significant halo value in terms of recruitment and retention through the NHS P&L or income and expenditure account, if we're in NHS language. And to give a flavour of that, in Oxford, the people budget is about 800 million a year. We spend about 60 million on recruitment and retention, and turnover is tracking back towards 20%. So if we can make an indent in that turnover, we can take significant savings through the I&E account. And the conversation that we need to have is, can we look at broader value as well as sustainability, impact on community, the fact we're not having lots of cars going in and out with people commuting long distances, as well as the well-being of individuals. Can we look at that when we're considering value in the round? So just to kind of circle back, the two things that we need to really unlock this conversation is the CDEL piece that Rowley's been talking about, and an update to a state code to actually give sign off that we can look at value in a broader context. And I'm going to just quickly go through some of the other things that are in the white paper, and we can pick them up in the Q&A. So finance is a big part of this. We've talked at the beginning about viability, and Rowley touched on that. We know that it's difficult, so how do we improve this? So if we have a pipeline of projects that the market can see coming through, that have got simplified governance, that don't take 2 years to sign off a business case, and have some standard yet flexible legal structures around them that people can research once and then apply again and again, that helps to drive down the cost of capital, lower the yield, and improve the viability, increasing the end value. Equally, if we had a methodology that we can understand rent, so what is a rent that supports recruitment, and help get investors comfortable about how that affordable rent reduces the void risk and therefore takes their risk down, that is another way of helping to improve viability. There is also, we think, a need for some gap funding. Now, whether that is for abnormal infrastructure, so particularly where we're talking about building on surface car parks, re-providing multi-storey car parks, or whether that is housing gap funding in the same way that we have social rent funding for local authority list affordable housing. And then the final thing we think is that would be really helpful listening to trusts is a revolving loan facility that could finance that initial feasibility work. So getting over that first hurdle of the art of the possible, which if we can do a bit of work on viability, on staff demand, on the planning position, we de-risk it significantly for developers, again, helping them manage their margin. But at the same time, if we have a revolving loan fund, we know how tight NHS budgets are. That could help with that budget requirement. Then we come on to procurement. Again, big conversation around procurement through the white paper. Particularly, trusts are obviously bound by public sector procurement rules. If you talk to the property world, then it'd be interesting to hear some views from the property world. That's pretty off-putting. To do a full-blown OSU procurement is cost prohibitive for some of those property organisations. So looking for a cost-effective procurement model that's robust, that's flexible, but also that can deliver a people-driven approach so that we can take into account actually who needs to be living in these properties from a trust perspective. And then some of the other ideas that are in the paper, so an NHS Homes Centre of Excellence. So pulling together all of this knowledge, there's been an incredible sharing of expertise, and I think that's one of the things I've been blown away by through this process is the willingness of everybody, public and private sector, to pull the knowledge, and I think we need a way of capturing that in the future. And then the final thing is demand surveys. So investors need to understand what the demand profiles are, and if the trust can do good quality demand surveys, ideally that we have some form of template and pro forma to make it simple for people, that will also help procurement and finance together. Planning is another key theme that's coming out through this conversation. So at the moment, planning is bespoke there is no NHS key worker housing category, so it's bespoke from planning authority to planning authority. And the things we've been looking at are, should we have a planning use class for NHS key worker homes? Can we expand the healthcare land use to cover employment-related housing, so we don't have to have a planning change of use? And can we look at the CDEL Section 106 contributions, particularly where this is on site? And then fundamentally, we need to come back to design and sustainability. We need to be building good quality homes and communities. This isn't about just more cluster flats by the incinerator. And there's two reasons for that. One is because we need recruitment and retention, but also for the long term for investors, if those properties are attractive in the open market, again, it reduces risk and therefore cost of capital. But sustainability is also key. We've got NHS net zero targets to meet. but also operating costs on sustainable homes is so much lower. And then ultimately, we need to look at the operating model. These homes, to recruit and retain people, they need to be good quality for the long term, not just good quality today. So we need to think about what are the operating models that help to make sure that that is delivered. And then there is also an opportunity for modern methods of construction here. If this is a key area where delivering at pace and scale would be welcome, we're not trying to filter these into an open market sale. Actually, the faster we can deliver this, the better. And that potential demand could help the whole nascent MMC industry. So that's just a flavour of some of the themes that are in that white paper. Ultimately, what we're trying to do is create homes and communities that improve the long-term retention, encouraging people to put down roots. We know that then consistency of team improves the care for our patients. Integrated facilities make these places a better place to work, better experience for not only the NHS people, but the patients and visitors on site, for those that are on site. And then long-term annuity income stream for the trust at the end of the operating contracts. Ultimately, we're looking for healthy homes, healthy for people, healthy for the planet, with the flexibility to redevelop in the long term. And the white paper, we asked for a joint ministerial task force to try and tackle some of these issues. Absolutely delighted that on the day before we published, we had confirmation that from Lord Markham that he and Rachel Maclean, the housing minister, are going to jointly chair a task force, and that task force is currently being put together. The two ministers are looking at the shape of that task force and finalising how it's going to work, but it's likely to include a number of pilot projects and potentially some working groups to look at crowdsourcing some of the expertise that we've been seeing come forward through the white paper. And what we'd really like to see in a perfect world is have the finance resolved, a business case sorted with a fast business case process, standardised planning, pro forma documentation, simple procurement, knowledge share, and a continuous improvement process. So we're clear about what we're trying to get to. The question is probably how. So Roly, do you want to kick off with some Q&A?
Yes, I can do. I've been frantically writing in the answers box. Okay, would it be helpful if I just read out some of the key ones? Yes.
Would you want to start with Ian's one about where we're standing with this model?
Yeah, of course. Yeah. So yeah, this model has long been socialised, so in terms of the joint ministerial task force, which was announced by Lord Markham, I think you just covered that, Sarah. I was writing at the time, so I'm sorry, but that announcement was as a result of having seen the white paper and particular interest on the CDEL compliant delivery model, so that it could be signed off at Treasury directly. So it was really encouraging. These things take time, as everything does in central government, and having delivered schemes with precisely this model structure before in a budgetary accounting context many times before, I'm comfortable that it's off balance sheet and is a CDEL compliant model. It's simply applying it to NHS delivery of homes. So it's progressing, and I'm expecting it to progress in a linear fashion and well. And we've delivered a number of accounting opinions in the past, in a past role for this commercial structure. So I'm confident we'll get there. So as a result, we are running those business case processes sort of at a cottage industry level, because the various trusts are bought into the history of how that model works. So it's kind of a watch this space on that one.
Okay, so should we run through? Let's run through the ones that you haven't answered to start with, and then we can go back through the ones that you've answered. If we've got time at the end. So News on the ministerial task force, Amy, I think we've covered that off. So the latest I had from the team at DHSC is that they are looking at just shaping that task force and exactly how it's going to work. So as soon as we hear any more, I think there'll probably be an announcement direct from DHSC anyway, but we will definitely update everyone once we hear a bit more. But it's very much a live conversation.
Yeah. Paul, nice to see you, Paul. Yes, this can be rolled out across the wider public sector. So the same rules apply in terms of how in terms of the balance sheet treatment, but of course across councils and MOD and MOJ, for example, they don't have the specific NHS CDEL barriers, but it's always music to the ears of finance directors if you can provide a capital compliance solution, if you like. But this is a really important point because many trusts don't necessarily have their own land or enough land, and a really good solution is to take the ICB approach, where we can aggregate different parcels of land and put different mixed-use developments on there. And some of the projects that we're doing are doing precisely that we are trying to figure out a way of delivering social and healthcare integration projects on land parcels that are part owned by a trust, part owned by a council, such that we still maintain the same balance sheet solution, and that those are working well. But so yeah, directly, Paul, the same solution does work in that way.
Okay. I'm going to pick up the one from Matthew about the need for having some form of design brief before going out for a development partner. I think that this is a really interesting part of the conversation, Matthew. So there are two ways of doing this. One is to go out using current estate code, putting a red line around a piece of land and effectively saying, developers, what would you like to put here given the market? There's a conversation about, can we define that as for NHS trusts? That is one really valid approach, and something that is being worked on, and potentially is another route through the CDEL conversation. I think one of the challenges that with that, and my development background, I led the redevelopment at Newbury Racecourse, which is 1,500 homes wrapped around the racecourse. So very much about how do you create a really quality environment for the long term that fits with your operation. So that's my background and where I come from on this. To do that, I think you do need to be clear about what your brief is. Not only in terms of who do you want to live in those homes. You don't need to design the homes, but you need to be clear about who you want to live there, but also about the type of place you're trying to create. And I think anything you can do upfront to de-risk that for developers in terms of initial conversations with the planning authority, what I call the art of the possible. So does it work in planning terms? Can you build it? What do you think the headline viability looks like? All of that will aid your conversation with developers, but it does take you into a procurement loop around you're then caught into public sector procurement rules. So I think when the ambition is to deliver really high quality places, it does need engagement upfront to think about what the brief is for those places, but it then needs a way through the procurement strategy that allows you to deliver that. But what we know from this conversation is that there are developers out there who are really keen to build good quality places to deliver affordable homes. And part of the challenge and the solution may be to look at also the takeoff for those developers, so they're not carrying the takeoff risk. So if we can get enough volume, at least show a pipeline of interest, we can start to get the pension capital and more of that patient capital interested. And we are seeing those conversations very live. If there's a takeoff approach, then that allows the developer to sit with a de-risked upfront piece and a de-risked takeoff. That reduction in risk reduces their margin and helps the viability of the scheme. So I agree with you. I think personally, there's a need to have a clear brief. It does take us down into the CDEL conversation and the procurement conversation, both of which are in the white paper and both of which are topics that the task force, I think, will be exploring in due course. Rolly, does that kind of cover what we've been talking about there, do you think?
Yeah. I'm just looking through. I've just answered a question about viability, and I've said this is one for you, Sarah, but I've given it a go. So just to answer, just in case you can't see it, there's a little been said about financial viability. Does the rents will need to service debts, capital interest. Does it stack up financially? If not, how big is the gap and how will this be filled? And I've just confirmed, well, I've just said that we do need to assess viability scheme by scheme, and where gaps exist, the task force is aiming to provide funding akin to the submarket sectors that already exist. So in, via Homes England, where affordable housing is done, there is a fund that delivers that. We're looking to explore with the task force how that would work in a key worker housing specific context, if I'm right, Sarah.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right, Reddy. So one of the things we're looking and having a conversation about is actually creating a viability model that we can use, so that we've got, I think part of this conversation is about bringing together the world of property finance and NHS, so we all understand where each other is coming from. And one of the key bits of that is helping everybody to understand how the viability on these schemes work and where the levers are. So they are challenging. It varies from area to area. It varies a lot on what you think the rent should be. So if it's a discount to market rent of 20% in Oxford, you're probably still pretty viable. If you want to make it an affordable rent for a brand one or two who's earning 20,000 a year, then clearly that's a different conversation. And part of it is about what mix can you have on the site. So viability is a challenge, and I think that's part of certainly the conversation that I had with the housing minister. They appreciate that, and they can see that there may be a role for not just affordable via registered providers, but another form of grant funding that helps support the gap. And I think what's really interesting is that viability funding will vary at different points in the market, and actually that quite an interesting conversation from the if you put your public sector hat on to say, okay, so if it has grant funding up front to help make it viable, then there should be some kind of clawback in the event that interest rates drop, yield changes, capital value rises, and the property is then moved on and someone takes a significant capital profit. So very much a live conversation. I think part of the task force I would really like to see is a subgroup working with finance and property to really work through this viability question and understand properly what it looks like. So really that I think is a bit more on that one.
Yeah. I think viability always comes up a lot here, because ultimately we're talking about investment, trying to get investment in schemes and get the investors behind all of this. That's going well. I mean, obviously we haven't covered a lot on procurement and planning, and they are also going to be difficult hurdles. But just to pick up on that, you're right. I felt as though the housing minister and Lord Markham were both very aware that not all schemes are going to stack up as they do in any housing context, and that help is needed from government to pump prime these schemes, particularly if we're looking at it on a salary band means testing basis for rentals. It's a stark reality that has to be addressed, and I think that's moved way further forward than it ever was before in terms of understanding that set of gaps that exist across the country for the scheme by scheme. And just to pick up on your point, Gareth, who's put in the comments that around risks for voids and underwrites, and yes, absolutely right, there's a balance to be struck here. Investors need to be comfortable that voids, while exposed, are covered, which is why we do a lot of staff surveying. I know at Oxford and with Sarah's team, they've done a lot of staff surveying and had many respondents. And what it does, with the right staff survey, you've got such a rich well of data there, because particularly if you go into the universities who are going to move up into the workforce, the medical students and nursing students, you've got your future demand, and you get such a rich well of data, because they will say what type of accommodation they want in year one, and then what type of accommodation they want in year two, and you're able to configure the site and on the footprint you've got, which is exactly commensurate with what your end user has asked for. And that's a really good way of providing comfort to investors that voids, while they exist as a risk, are highly mitigated, because we've spoken to the future and existing users of that end product. So those conversations are ongoing with investors about how we get comfortable with lowering cost of capital on that basis. Do we kind of squeeze it into the annuities book and think about those regulations, or do we think about it as equity capital but at a lower risk because of that well and robustly put together demand analysis?
So, Roly, Kate, I think we said 45 minutes. Kate, are we due to wind up?
I think you're on mute, Kate.
Thank you, Sarah. Yeah, so we said 45 to 50 minutes. If you've got any pressing questions, that's okay. Otherwise, there will be the question and answer document that we will supply to everyone who's registered via Eventbrite to join this webinar. If you haven't registered via Eventbrite, please do go on to the NHS Homes Alliance website or our LinkedIn page, or obviously I have put some information about contacting Roly or Sarah directly as well. So we definitely will keep you updated. And like I said, the rest of the questions that we haven't got round to will be answered then.
And I think also the other thing, Kate, we were going to look at, be good to get people's feedback afterwards, is we're looking at what happens next from here in terms of this conversation. So I think if people would like to get in touch either with you through the Global City Futures email that's on, or with me, we can look at how we shape this conversation going forward. So whether you'd like another webinar, or whether actually we do some smaller roundtables where we can actually, I'd really like to hear the voices and have a bit more of a conversation through this group, whether we do them some in person and some online. So really interested to hear who'd like to be involved in those conversations and what the topics might be that we bring to those conversations. But thank you very much, everybody. It's been really engaged. I'm really sorry we can't answer all the questions that are live on the screen, and it would be great to replicate the conversation we had in person, because I think there's a huge amount we can learn from one another. So thank you.